Move on to the clerk, who will proceed to read the orders of the day.
Trade, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Bill, Lords, second reading.
Now.
Secretary of State Kemi Badenoch to move second reading.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time. This government is proud to champion free trade at every opportunity. We recognise the power and potential of free and fair trade to ease the cost of living, to lower prices, and to extend consumer choice, all of this driving growth across all four nations of our United Kingdom. As exemplified by the free trade agreements we recently brought into force with Australia and New Zealand, it is UK businesses and UK consumers that benefit when burdensome red tape is cut, greater market access is secured, and trade flows more freely. The UK's accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership will help us realise these benefits with 11 countries spanning the Americas and Asia. Honourable members will know that this partnership covers a vast area of the globe, 500 million people, which already accounts for well over £100 billion in UK trade. Our accession will boost this flow of goods and services even further, leaving over 99% of UK products eligible for zero tariffs. This matters because we sell more to CPTPP countries than we do to France and Italy combined. As we join, this partnership will have a combined GDP of roughly £12 trillion in 2022 figures, equivalent to almost 15% of the world's total. It will also provide a gateway to the wider Indo-Pacific region, which is set to account for the majority of global economic growth by 2050.
Would my right honourable friend agree?
Yes.
Would my right honourable friend agree that by leaving the EU it's possible now to secure these deeper economic and diplomatic ties with some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's only because of the decisions this government's taken that we are now getting on with that job?
My right honourable friend is correct. We would not be able to sign this agreement had we not left the European Union. So we're able to enjoy the benefits of this free trade agreement as well as the free trade agreement that we have with the European Union.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Many of the figures that are sometimes quoted about the future size and scope of the Indo-Pacific market, of course, include the size and growth of China. I wonder if she's reflected further on the evidence that she gave to the Select Committee last week and whether she can tell the House whether, if China decides to try and join CPTPP and meets the technical standards, will the UK block that or will it welcome it?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman knows what I said, the right honourable gentleman, I should say, knows what I said at committee. I will come on to this later on in my remarks for this bill, but it is really important to stress the principle that these are not decisions that the UK takes in isolation, but he will hear more about the arguments about accession later on in my speech. As I was saying, the CPTPP will also provide a gateway to the wider Indo-Pacific region, which is set to account for the majority of global economic growth by 2050. One of the major benefits of our accession is that it gives us a trade deal with Malaysia and Brunei for the first time, economies worth over £340 billion in GDP. What does this mean for British business? Well, it means, for example, that British-made cars exported to Malaysia will see tariffs cut from 30% to zero, and it means our whisky exporters will see tariffs cut from 80% to zero, something which has been widely welcomed by the Scotch Whisky Association. Yes, I will.
She's spoken about the size of this particular deal, the CPTPP, and she's just talking about the major players in our markets, of automotive and whisky, which are, of course, very big exports. I wonder if she could say something about the opportunities for smaller and medium-sized enterprises and the opportunities that may exist for them and the work that's being done to open those opportunities up to them.
The honourable gentleman is right. There will be multiple benefits for small businesses. The tariffs, which I have just discussed, are an example. But the agreement actually has an SME chapter. So there is a chapter specifically written to assist small and medium-sized enterprises with taking advantage of this agreement. Yes.
Thank the Minister for giving way. She mentions car exports to Malaysia. Of course, that won't make up for the millions of pounds that we're now at risk of losing because of the suspension of the deal with Canada for the car automotive industry. And this bill will do nothing to tackle that, because that is based on the accumulation of EU content that we need. So can she tell us what on earth she's going to do to fight for British car makers, given that we're now going to get the worst of all worlds and we're not even part of a Canada-style deal with Canada?
First of all, Canada is part of CPTPP. And secondly, the rules of origin which he's referring to are still something that have not fully been decided. That comes in March. We are working with our counterparts in Canada. I think she's confusing the discussions on rules of origin with cheese, two totally different issues. I thought he was intervening. Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker. So UK companies will also enjoy greater market access in some of the 9 countries with which we already have bilateral agreements. If we take Mexico, for example, under our current bilateral agreements, chocolate producers have to pay a tariff of around 25%. Upon accession, that will drop to 0%. We also said from the outset of our negotiations that we would like our businesses to benefit from the key trade quotas this agreement offers. I'm pleased to tell the House that we have secured access to those quotas as part of our negotiations. That means, amongst other things, we have secured better access for UK dairy producers selling to Canada, Japan and Mexico. That's likely the reason why Minette Batters, the National Farmers Union president, has stated that this agreement could provide good opportunities to get even more fantastic British food on plates overseas. An outcome I'm sure all honourable and right honourable members here today would warmly welcome. I give way.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Can I commend the Trade Secretary and the Government with their stance with our friends and allies in Canada that the UK will not permit the importation of hormone-treated beef. Can I commend them on that? It is so important that we can be a beacon to the rest of the world on this particular issue. Can the Secretary of State then reaffirm to this House and the country that we will stand firm on this in terms of continuing to prohibit the importation of hormone-treated beef, ractopamine-treated pork and chlorine-washed poultry? It is so vital that we uphold these animal health and welfare standards that also help protect human public health as well.
I'm very happy to confirm to my right honourable friend that this is the case. We are now in a position to take our own decisions on what we do with trade agreements. We have always said that we're never going to compromise on animal welfare standards, on environmental standards. We still continue to regulate. So the difference between this deal and perhaps the sort of deal that we had previously with the EU was that we did not have complete freedom to regulate. And that is why we've been able to take the decision which he has rightly referenced. Madam Deputy Speaker, another notable benefit concerns rules of origin. Joining this partnership will mean that content from any CPTPP country can be counted as qualifying when goods are exported within the trading bloc. And this has the potential to benefit our innovative British-based manufacturers, including our car industry. If you look at the automotive sector, we have an exceptionally competitive global market, especially as we transition to electric vehicles. The minerals needed in their production are critical minerals, which are inevitably difficult to source in a global supply chain. Having more countries recognise where a component is made and accepting it as part of one supply chain is essential for the success of our industry. For example, if one of our big automotive manufacturers, say in the West Midlands, ships a part to Mexico for additional assembly, that part is then sent on to another CPTPP country like Japan for final manufacturing. Post-accession, the parts made in the West Midlands will meet the agreement's rules of origin. That is a real incentive for these countries to purchase more British-designed, British-made products. That's part of the reason why our future accession to this partnership has been so warmly welcomed by the sector. For example, Mike Hawes, CEO of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, has said that this agreement makes eminent sense and has the potential to deliver opportunities for the automotive industry. Yes, I'll give way.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way, and it's good to hear from Mike Hawes and what he thinks. But could she just give the House some indication of what the contribution to our GDP will be as a result of the CPTPP?
It's the models and estimates were at 2 billion a year. However, this all depends on which countries choose to accede and how many businesses in the UK choose to take advantage of this agreement. And so what that means is that an FDA utilisation programme is going to be absolutely critical to make sure that we get the very most benefits from this agreement. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Because I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. And there's a lot of argument about where the opportunity for UK exporters is. Does she not agree with me that the current predictions for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is the 10 nations of ASEAN will create a bigger trading bloc and a bigger economic unit than the European Union will do by 2050, and that CPTPP offers the opportunity for countries such as the Kingdom of Thailand, which is not currently a member, to join in the future. So CPTPP actually is not about what it is now, it's about what it will be in the future.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. This is a deal that is thinking about the future. Of course, we have a close trading relationship with the European Union, but the fact is, as a share of global growth, Europe is shrinking and other parts of the world are growing. This is our opportunity to get in very early and be able to help shape the rules for this trading bloc. So I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Yes, I give it.
I'm very grateful to the Business Secretary who's making a powerful case as to why the accession to the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to be transformative for our country in so many ways. She's alluded to the importance of business with Malaysia, and it's not just about trade. It is, of course, also about investment. The importance of Malaysian investment over here, symbolised by Brabazon on the edge of Bristol and by the Battersea Power Station. All of those investments will be much more secure under the umbrella of the first ever trade and investment agreement with Malaysia. Would she agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yes, I would agree with that statement. And I would just like to highlight, Madam Deputy Speaker, the significant contribution that our trade envoys, both previous speakers, are making to our debate on trade. They are getting out there, bringing business to the United Kingdom, selling all that is great about our country and making a valuable contribution to trade policy in the UK. And I want to take the opportunity to thank them for all the work that they are doing, travelling around the world, banging the drum for British trade. Yes.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary. I just wanted to make an intervention before she perhaps moves off cars to Canada, which is, of course, £745 million worth of exports, and which currently benefits from tariff-free trade because of the extended accumulation of origin rules. That tariff break basically ends at the end of March. At the moment, because the talks are broken down, we face a situation where our car exports are about to be hit by tariffs. Can the Secretary of State just tell the House a little bit more about how she plans to avoid a tariff wall hitting UK car exports at the end of March?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. It's a good opportunity for me to state explicitly talks have not broken down. There are multiple discussions that we are having with Canada on cheese, where we have not come to an agreement. However, the quotas that we have in CPTPP with Canada, 16.5 kilotons, are more than what we are selling to Canada at the moment, 2 kilotons. So we're not particularly concerned about that, although it is disappointing. We have a rules of origin discussion that is ongoing, and we have an FTA discussion, which I have paused for reasons which he will know. However, he should know them because I believe I referred to them in the select committee. So I hope that he was listening. But the point I'm making to the chair of the select committee, that trade is very dynamic. There are some issues which we are negotiating and discussing with our partners, which we have differences of opinion, and there are others which are going swimmingly. This is not a reason for us to cast aspersions on our trade relationships with those countries. Madam Deputy Speaker, joining this partnership will deliver for our manufacturers, but crucially, it'll deliver for our globally renowned services sector too. The UK is already the world's second largest exporter of services, behind only the US, and services exports are at record levels. CPTPP, with its modern and ambitious rules on services and digital trade, plays to the UK strengths, given almost 80% of our economy is services-based. It means reducing market access barriers like data localization requirements, so British businesses won't have to set up costly servers or data centers in each member country, saving them significant time, money and resources. This agreement will help flagship British businesses like Standard Chartered and BT gain smoother access to markets in Singapore, Vietnam and Malaysia, strengthening our trade with these nations for years to come. We've got a ratchet mechanism too for the first time with Malaysia, Chile, Mexico, Peru, Singapore, Brunei and Vietnam, meaning that if these countries relax rules for a particular service, those restrictions cannot then be reintroduced in future. Another clear example of how this agreement will unlock smoother, simpler trade. As the Director General of the Institute of Export and International Trade, Mark Forgione, has rightly said, this is all good news for UK businesses, giving them greater access to one of the fastest growing regions in the world. Because it's not just about the specific benefits that joining this partnership will bring over the short term. This is a growing agreement designed to expand and bring in more markets and more opportunities for UK businesses over the long run too. And as the first acceding country, we will be ideally placed to take advantage of that future growth. The chair of the Select Committee. Yes, of course.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. I welcome accession to CPTPP, which I think will be a great national benefit. But understandably, there will be members across the House who are looking to the businesses in their own constituency. The Secretary of State is well aware that my constituency in the Humber region is very focused on the energy sector, particularly renewable energy. Does you see any great advantages for them?
There are multiple advantages which will be accrued by my honourable friend's constituency. I don't specifically have figures for the energy sector, but I do have some good news relating to Yorkshire and the Humber, and that's that, and that's the 465 businesses already exporting to Malaysia from Yorkshire and the Humber, and CPTPP will help boost that region's economy by around £210 million in the long run. In 2022, Yorkshire and the Humber exported £1.3 billion worth of goods to CPTPP. So tariffs of up to 30% will be eliminated on UK exports of machinery to Malaysia within 5 years, cutting costs for businesses in that region. We will be reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers, which could see many more companies like jukebox manufacturer Sound Leisure, which already exports to 5 CPTPP countries. They will be able to enter more dynamic markets. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chair of the Select Committee raised China, and I promised to address those in my speech. So on China's application to accede to the agreement, which I know many honourable members are interested in, let me first say that there are currently 6 economies with applications to join the group: China, Taiwan, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Uruguay and Ukraine. More may apply. Members have not yet made any decisions on which economies will accede in future. Every applicant must fulfil 3 essential criteria to join the group called the Auckland Principles. First, they must be able to meet the high standards of the agreement. Second, they must have a track record of compliance with existing trade commitments. And crucially, third, they must command a consensus of the whole group. These are strong criteria, and they make clear that working as a bloc is vital. The purpose of this partnership is to be a growing trade bloc, and we share that ambition, and we want to see this agreement grow. But our own accession has set a clear precedent for those that follow. The robust process the UK has been through has only reinforced the high standards the partnership seeks to promote, and it has proved that the bar is not easy to meet. Yes, I will.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and doesn't this just prove that by being positive, by seeking to engage with partners around the world, we can now shape this trade area in line with our own geostrategic and trade interests?
Yes, it does. It absolutely does do that. It is one of the ways that we are able to increase UK influence across the world, not just within Europe or near neighbouring countries. So he's absolutely right on that.
State for giving way. The Secretary of State talks about free and fair trade and talks about high standards. There is nothing on labour rights in this deal, the CPTPP. Is that because she does not care about labour rights? Does she not think it matters whether UK businesses and workers have to compete with products and services which are made in circumstances where there's no trade union rights or there's no health and safety, etc.? Was it because she doesn't care about labour rights or because she wasn't able to negotiate anything?
The Honourable Lady might be confusing the contents of the bill with the text of the agreement. The text of the agreement is on gov.uk, and she will find that there is a chapter there that covers labour rights. I will now briefly turn, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the specific contents of this bill. They are technical in nature, but by enabling us to comply with the provisions of the deal, they are crucial in unlocking the benefits I've described. First, the bill will ensure the UK's domestic procurement regime is compliant with the partnership's rules and gives effect to the UK's market access commitments to CPTPP suppliers. This small change will deliver big benefits for British business, allowing them to compete for contracts in Canada, Japan and Peru that go beyond our existing agreements. It will also mark the UK's first ever trade agreement containing government procurement provisions with Malaysia and Brunei, creating entirely new access opportunities for UK businesses. The bill will also allow conformity assessment bodies established in parties' territories to apply for approval in the UK. This will mirror the treatment that UK conformity assessment bodies will receive from CPTPP parties, which would reduce costs for UK businesses. The bill will amend domestic law so that in relation to agri-foods only, an application to register a GI, geographical indicator, can be opposed on the ground it is likely to cause confusion with a pre-existing trademark or application for a trademark. The bill will also introduce the ability to cancel a registered agri-food GI on the grounds that as at the time the GI was applied for, it was likely to cause confusion with a pre-existing trademark or application for a trademark, or because it was a generic term. Finally, the bill brings our approach to copyright in line with the CPTPP by amending the basis on which foreign performers, for example musicians, can qualify for rights in the UK. In sum, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the implementation of this bill is essential for the UK to meet its obligations upon accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's an agreement which offers significant benefits to UK businesses and consumers, lowering tariffs, driving up trade and giving us access to the markets which will be front and centre of the global economy for the next quarter century. It is right that we seize the many opportunities the partnership will bring, which is why I commend this legislation to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Gareth Thomas.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, we support accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. We have concerns about the bill and we will be seeking additional safeguards, but we will not be seeking to divide the House this evening. As my honourable friend for Walthamstow and the chair of the Select Committee have previously raised, this is a bill overshadowed by the apparent collapse of bilateral FTA negotiations with Canada, one of CPTPP's most important members. There has been no statement to the House. I read through the transcript of the Select Committee of the Secretary of State's evidence to the Business Select Committee and saw no reference to the collapse of those negotiations. As I understand it, there hasn't even been a written statement to the House. It's one further sign of the cavalier approach to trade from members opposite.
Because this does really matter, with £750 million worth of British car exports at stake. The Canadian Trade Minister, Mary Ning, has said that she's disappointed that the talks have fallen apart, and she said that on the record. So the ministers opposite on the benches shouting fake news need to be clear and honest with British jobs and British workers whose rights are at stake. Does my friend agree with me that we need some honesty from the government? If they think the talks haven't fallen apart, can they tell us when they're going to start again?
Well, I welcome my honourable friend's intervention and her call for clarity from the Secretary of State, because it's a collapse that leaves our exporters to Canada worse off than when we were in Europe. There's been no deal with the US, no deal by Diwali with India, no courage to do a veterinary agreement with the EU, and now this failure by ministers opposite. This bill and accession to CPTPP, of course.
I welcome his enthusiasm for the Canada agreement. But can he explain why he personally voted against the UK doing the deal with Canada in the first place on the 8th of February 2017?
The honourable gentleman has got some gall asking that question, bearing in mind that he promised us in the trade bill discussions that we had just a couple of years ago that he was going to negotiate a better agreement with the EU. Now we find ourselves in the position of having worse terms of trade with Canada than we were in the EU. And it's striking, too, that one of the issues that bedevilled those discussions on the EU-Canada deal have now been supported by members opposite. The Secretary of State specifically sought to avoid ISDS provisions in the bilateral deal with Canada, which have now collapsed, concerns that we were raising at the time. This bill and the accession to CPTPP are not going to make up for the tens of millions of pounds of extra costs that manufacturers, the car industry, will face on exports to Canada from the loss of EU accumulation rights and the higher tariffs that will result from April. And this bill isn't going to be much help either for dairy businesses exporting to Canada, cheese exporters facing tariffs of 245% now because ministers opposite were too late to try and stop the loss of a vital quota for tariff rate reductions. Ministers had to be woken up to this issue by questions from this side of the House.
Gentleman for giving way. I guested on the Trade Committee last week and specifically raised the issue of cheese, and if you'd been paying attention, you'd have heard that our tariff rate quota does not exceed the amount we've previously exported. Therefore, cheese producers can sleep well at night, particularly those in Wensleydale.
Well, what happens in Wensleydale, I don't know, but I have seen the comments and worries of other cheese exporters. And I want to come to the honourable gentleman's contribution at the Select Committee hearing, because I noted that he shared the concerns of many on this side of the House about ISDS provisions. The Secretary of State said negotiations on the loss of those EU accumulation rights for our exports of cars and other manufactured goods haven't come to an end. But it's difficult to see how the Secretary of State pulling the plug on bilateral discussions with Canada over a new FTA will exactly help secure those accumulation rights going forward. A trade deal should work for all parts of the country, including farmers. But evidence to the Select Committee makes clear that the accession to CPTPP will mean further losses to the agricultural sector and semi-processed agricultural food sector too. Now, ministers have been sending signals for some time that they are willing to ignore farmers. A deal with Europe that put huge barriers to trade up for British farmers, a deal with Australia, whereas one of Britain's own negotiating team said we gave away far too much for far too little, and now further losses through CPTPP.
And is being extremely selective about the evidence that was given to the Trade Select Committee last week, because when we had the Trade and Agriculture Commission come in front of us, which is the statutory body that is there to review the trade deal agreements that we signed, they said that there was no overall impact to UK farming from membership of CPTPP. Would you like to correct the record?
As the honourable gentleman knows, other evidence was given to the Select Committee which did underline the likely loss of trade for for farmers and for the agricultural sector in general. Happy to send to him afterwards the note from that Select Committee. On the bill before us today, there are questions about the intellectual property section of the bill. Wider concerns that Britain has been forced to be a rule-taker over the use of secret courts and poor environmental and labour rights provisions. And crucially, that ministers have no plan to help British business capitalise on this deal. But given the government's woeful performance on economic growth, the huge increases to barriers to trade recently, the cuts in support to exporters, we're pleased for any measures that do help our exporters even a fraction. The Secretary of State didn't own up in her opening remarks, but for the foreseeable future, this trade deal is going to have at best a minor impact on our terms of trade. There are trade benefits to membership, notably in the rules of origin provisions or in trade with Malaysia and Brunei, and potential in the longer term if CPTPP becomes a deeper or more extensive trade bloc. In geopolitical terms, the closer ties with allies in the Indo-Pacific, which CPTPP ushers in these increasingly uncertain times, are welcome. Unfortunately, rational debate about these opportunities and the trade-offs has been hampered by some of the more extravagant and exaggerated claims made by members opposite for the benefits of CPTPP membership. It was set to offer unparalleled opportunities for the UK. It was going to be a glittering post-Brexit prize. The Secretary of State has even done her own bit for such boosterism. Her department claiming last year that all that was needed was for the US and half the rest of the world to join, and there'd be an extra £21 billion for the UK. Now, I enjoyed the film Wonka, but I didn't expect to find that level of fantasy preparing for this debate. It's a trade treaty that, according to the government's own figures, was only ever going to deliver a 0.08% increase to economic growth over 10 years. Nice to have, particularly given the mess the party opposite are making of the economy. Now even those limited trade benefits members opposite promised us have been cut in half. I give way to the Secretary of State.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman references trade figures given by my own department. These are modelling forecasts based on old figures that did not apply, did not count dynamic effects of the trade agreement, completely out of date. They were done well before the agreement had even been negotiated and should not be used as a basis for deciding how well this agreement should go.
Well, one set of figures that the Secretary of State's department definitely didn't put together were figures that the Office for Budget Responsibility produced, which now expect only a 0.04% increase in our economic growth after a decade from joining CPTPP. Since we already have free trade agreements in place with 9 of the other 11 CPTPP members, formally CPTPP feels rather thin compensation for Ministers' many other failures on trade.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. In the light of the news that the figures that have been tabled by the department, I can barely believe this, but we've just heard that they're not accurate. Would he, like me, have expected a new impact assessment to have gone alongside this bill, with the latest departmental assessments set out clearly therein?
Well, it would have been an excellent idea if the Secretary of State had published those. And perhaps she might be willing to publish those at the same time as give us a statement about what exactly is going on in the negotiations with Canada. We will have to use the review of CPTPP in 2026 to try and increase more markedly the benefits of membership for British jobs, for British consumers and for growth. Give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Shadow Minister, but interestingly, he's trying to have his cake and eat it. On the one hand, he's saying that this side of the House has made extravagant claims for the importance of TPP, and on the other hand, he's recognising that actually it will have a useful, modest role. And in terms of the statistics that the department might produce, does he not agree that in fact it would be very difficult for the department to project accurately what might happen over the next 10 years, because there are a whole cluster of nations, at least 3 of them within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations itself, who might well apply to join, but you can't speculate on that in advance. So it's the potential of the opportunity that he would surely agree actually does recognise a decent-sized prize for the United Kingdom.
All I say to the Honourable Gentleman is I've recognised that there are benefits to accession. It's why we're not seeking to divide the House tonight. And I want to come on to the issue of potential new countries joining CPTPP in a little bit. The temptation by ministers to exaggerate the significance of what this bill ushers in. Why not?
I thank him for giving way. And given that he recognises there are opportunities from this deal, and given that he recognises that we do, thanks to the success of our continuity agreement programme, have trade deals with many countries there already, doesn't he accept that the diagonal accumulation that is part of CPTPP is a huge boost to British businesses in terms of supply chains?
Well, as I think the Honourable Gentleman may have heard, or perhaps he wasn't listening, I did acknowledge that one of the benefits that will come from CPTPP accession is better rules of origin. But I just gently say to him that I don't think we should nonetheless exaggerate the benefits of those, because the benefits are not likely to be that huge. Important to have, of course, given the economic mess he and other former ministers helped to create, but nonetheless modest. I understand, as I said, the temptation by ministers to exaggerate the significance of what this bill ushers in is understandable, given that over the last 10 years Britain has had the worst export record of any member of the G7 apart from Japan. It's one part of the explanation why the British people have lower living standards now than when Labour left office. One reason why the British people are on average £10,000 worse off since 2010. and key to why the UK is forecast to have the lowest growth of the G7 this year. Ministers opposite have published no trade strategy, no clarity about how this bill fits in with wider trade ambitions. They've axed support to help businesses get to trade shows and cut funding for business groups to lead trade missions. And there's little obvious planning to help businesses use the limited extra opportunities opened up through this bill and other trade deals. Sensible policies to improve trade with Europe and cut red tape have been vetoed, so it's sadly not surprising, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility now expects our trade to grow by just 0.1% this year and the next 2 years. A shameful record. There's little sign... I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point. And when I was previous in a former life sitting on the International Trade Select Committee, one of the things that we talked about was actually giving Parliament greater scrutiny of trade deals before they were validated. Does he think that we should, in this place, have more opportunity to scrutinise these deals? Because as he's describing it, what is being presented today is negligible in its contribution to UK growth, as has been explained.
Well, I do share my honourable friend's opinion. He aired it too on the trade bill a couple of years ago, and I hope he might be willing to air it on the bill committee for this particular bill. There is little sign either, Mr Deputy Speaker, of a plan to ensure this bill helps CPTPP accession boost trade in the nations and regions of the UK. The Resolution Foundation published analysis last week showing that despite all the promises of levelling up, more than 50% of services exports are concentrated in just one region of the UK. Ministers have never been interested in tackling those huge imbalances. We all remember on this side of the House the broken promises on trade, the oven-ready Brexit deal, levelling up through trade, 80% of the world being covered by new trade agreements. One by one, each of these promises the party opposite made to the British people have been broken. No one outside Conservative circles will be surprised that this bill isn't going to lead to a huge boost to economic growth anytime soon. The negotiations to join CPTPP were led by the same people who gave Australian farmers everything they wanted, by the same ministers who boasted about a trade deal with Japan, which will help their exporters 4 times more than ours, and which has been championed by the very same ministers who negotiated a trade treaty with Europe that's hiked up trade barriers, increased the cost of food, and generated huge bureaucracy for business. On arrangements for scrutiny of this bill, one would have hoped ministers would have learned lessons from previous trade bills this House has considered, and that scrutiny arrangements before and after negotiations might have improved. We have, at least, Mr Deputy Speaker, not had the spectacle of trade ministers at war for a little while, or failing to turn up to a select committee to answer basic questions about trade agreements. But when even Lord Frost, and I appreciate he's not quite so popular anymore, but when even Lord Frost can lament debating this very bill in the other place, that scrutiny of trade agreements was better when we were in the European Union, there is clearly some way to go. All the more so because ministers appear to be using this bill to solve an apparent problem with intellectual property treaty rules, which may or may not be linked to CPTPP. The minister in the Lords didn't seem to be too clear. A mere 2 weeks ago, and only after pressure in the other place, ministers rushed out a consultation document on this provision of the bill, contained in Clause 5, which potentially gives American and other overseas businesses huge sums that would otherwise have helped emerging British artistic talent. That consultation won't be finished until the 11th of March, and there's absolutely no clue as to when ministers might have finished considering the responses and deign to let us all have their thoughts on the way forward. I will in a second. I want to finish making this point, though. During bilateral trade negotiations, the government was widely accused of giving in to the demands of Australian negotiators far too easily, creating dangerous precedents for those wanting to get access to our agricultural markets through other trade deals. It does appear that ministers are in danger of doing something similar with the copyright provisions in this bill, giving away when there appears to be no reason to do so extra rights to receive payments to foreign performers in, for example, America, as quoted in the consultation document, not currently a member of CPTPP, which would reduce the earnings of our artists and our businesses here, and which could hold back development of the next generation of British musicians and artists. Industry figures argue that there's nothing in CPTPP to justify the need to give foreign rights holders and performers payments where they do not currently receive them. If ministers think those industry voices are wrong, then I look forward to the minister winding up for the government, spelling out what specifically it is in CPTPP that requires the change. There was, for example, nothing in the trade deals with Australia or Japan, despite both being CPTPP members, that required such a legal change then. So why now? What it looks like is that ministers are trying to sneak through changes to rules that are at best only loosely related to CPTPP, using this legislation instead of a separate and proper process and debate about why such changes are needed. It would be a start if the minister winding up this debate could then explain to the House why changes, let's be clear, that could cost millions of pounds to British artists over the next decade, more than £100 million potentially, according to the government's own figures. Why are changes to how foreign record labels and foreign recording artists qualify for payment rights necessary now? We will want to explore in committee too why ministers have not sought exemptions to the ISDS provisions in CPTPP, as our allies in Australia and New Zealand have done, or indeed as Canada did with the US during US-MCA negotiations. It's all the more surprising as ministers were specifically trying to avoid ISDS provisions in the now collapsed UK-Canada FTA negotiations. There has been a significant increase in legal disputes using ISDS provisions and a series of cases that have had a chilling impact on a range of progressive public policies, environmental issues, labour standards and on public services. We are yet to hear a convincing explanation from ministers as to why ISDS is still needed, a point that the honourable gentleman referenced in the Select Committee next week. I give way to him.
Forgive me, I may have misheard, but did you just say that the Australia deal was a bad deal for farmers and it's increasing the cost of food? Because certainly Australian wine is now cheaper on our shelves and our biggest food or drink export is Scotch whisky, which always benefits from free trade deals.
Well, I remember the comments of the NFU about the Australia deal, and perhaps the honourable gentleman might want to look back at those before he rushes to make such an intervention again. We will explore too in committee the further threat to Britain's steel industry from the possibility of cheap imports of iron and steel from Vietnam, but which actually may be produced in China. And on China, there has been growing debate about its interest in acceding to the CPTPP and its record on human rights. There are, as my noble friend Lord Collins in the other place pointed out, no meaningful enforceable human rights provisions in the treaty. There's nothing in law at the moment that requires ministers to allow debate in the House if there is agreement among CPTPP members to support China's accession, or indeed for any other country from joining CPTPP. So I hope ministers will set out how they will ensure transparency over their consideration of new country applications once we're members of CPTPP. And there continue to be a series of concerns about how environmental issues such as deforestation, climate change and pesticide use are dealt with through CPTPP. The government's record doesn't encourage confidence that those issues were close to the forefront of ministers' minds during negotiations.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is making an excellent point. Does he agree with me that there's a huge amount of public concern about the way that the government has been managing environmental issues in its trade negotiations, both in the Australian one and indeed in this one?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and we certainly hope to pursue those issues during committee, and he'd be very welcome to join us in so doing. Mr Speaker, there are benefits to joining CPTPP, and we support doing so. But there are real concerns as to whether ministers have got us the best deal possible, and we will revisit those concerns in committee.
Anthony Mangnall.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I would say that it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for Harrow West, but he is so doom and gloom and pessimistic It makes me think that he is the Goldilocks of international trade. We are always in the same place when Labour debates these issues because we can't sign trade agreements quick enough for them, or perhaps we take too long a time. The point is that we sign trade agreements in this country when they are good for our businesses, good for our producers, good for our consumers, and that is exactly where we must be. He talks about membership on CPTPP and says that there are no parameters to stop, but in the opening remarks, the Secretary of State made the point about the Auckland Principles and the fact that it has to be a consensual-based approach for new membership. And of course, then they criticise our record on international trade and the agreements that we have signed, discounting the fact that we have an agreement with Australia and New Zealand, 3 memorandums of understanding with American states, 75 rollover deals, discussions underway with the Gulf Cooperation Council and Israel and India, and of course now accession to CPTPP, depending on whether or not we pass this bill. And the purpose of this bill are for the parameters for us to change our legislative programme to make sure that ratification can take place. That is why we're here, and that is what we're discussing in this debate. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am delighted to be a member of the Business and Trade Select Committee, and I welcome the fact that CPTPP is our accession into the fastest growing region in the world. I value the fact that it plays huge geopolitical value to the UK and what we do with our friends and allies around the world. And for anyone who wants a report to send them to sleep, they can read my report for the Centre for Policy Studies called Looking East. Or, of course, the fact that we are joining the leading comprehensive free trade agreement, with every forecast pointing out the value that this agreement, this body, will play, not just in the next 10 years, but in the next 5. We have to recognise these benefits. And as has already been said, in nearly every case, the forecasts of every single free trade agreement always undervalues it, not least because of the modelling forecast, but also because as free trade agreements are signed, accessions are completed, businesses start to take advantage of those free trade agreements and they grow as a result. Delighted to.
My honourable friend makes a very good point, but he does not agree that the experience of previous trade deals, where we've looked at them on a previous committee, which we're both members of, is that the very fact that you do a trade deal creates an interest which wasn't otherwise there by the fact that everybody is now talking about the trade opportunity that has now presented itself.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I could not agree more. This is exactly the reason that we have trade envoys, and in his case in Thailand, to be able to go and enhance the relationship between Thai and UK businesses. But it is also for the exact reason that if you go onto the UK Gov website on CPTPP, the first line says, "We will help businesses take advantage of CPTPP. Please keep logging on so you can see how we can help you to take advantage of the things." Far from stepping back and not helping businesses, we are front-footed in making sure that we can support those businesses. Now, I do want to make a couple of points that I have learned since from my time both on the standalone Trade Select Committee and now the Business and Trade Select Committee, which is that it is always important within our trade agreements to have a say in this House and to have a debate on the full terms of our trade agreements. And of course, under CRAG, set out in 2010, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, we have 21 sitting days to be able to debate CPTPP. I know the Secretary of State came in front of the Trade Committee, Business and Trade Committee last week. I hope that we can have that debate because I think it is important for all members of this House to be able to look at the very many benefits that CPTPP will bring them, their constituents, their producers, their consumers, and to be able to highlight those on the floor of the House. I also would like to point out that CRAG is also accompanied with a votable motion, something that has never been used since the introduction of it in 2010, and it would be useful to have that vocal support for our trade agreements, not least to show our friends and allies who we do these deals with that we are behind them. Now, within this bill, I note the changes to the procurement legislative framework. I commend the fact that it is already building upon the excellent work that has been done by the Procurement Act that was passed last year. Again, another piece of legislation that the honourable gentleman of the Labour front bench could have made reference to, a piece of legislation that specifically helps small businesses take advantage of the agreements that we sign. Or he could have registered the Digital Trades Document Bill that we've also passed on that basis. The list goes on. I could go on if you would like me to. Of course, there's also the value on intellectual property, setting a minimum standard of protections across patents, geographical indicators, copyrights, trade secrets, trademarks and designs, including enforcement mechanisms within it. And of course, above all, not just around focusing on how to remove tariffs, but also how to remove non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade, creation of a conformity assessment producers, and ensuring that we can help businesses from every walk of life to take advantage, again, of this fastest growing region. Delighted to.
Because my honourable friend has made a number of absolutely correct statements about what the benefits of this agreement will be. And to bring it alive in the specific context of our first ever trade and investment agreement with Malaysia, we will see, because we'll be working very closely together with their ministries, opportunities for joint marketing in ways that we perhaps haven't often seen around the world. And it's worth remembering that actually our investments over there, which are considerable, generate dividends back to this country, which are as important as attracting inward investment here, that of course gives them dividends back there. So does he agree with me that the opportunities are there in this bill for everyone to recognise, that it's helpful to have the Labour Party finally actually agreeing that free trade agreements, and this particular one, are a positive step forward for the country, and that we should all recognise the opportunities that come after this are in mobilising our chambers of commerce and our SMEs to take advantage of them.
I thank the honourable gentleman for allowing me to get my breath back, but also for the points that he makes. And I hope the SNP is listening, because they could make a hat-trick and support their first international free trade agreement while they're at it. But of course he's absolutely right. We talk about the export and we talk about the export value and also the import impact. We have to recognise both sides of this, and we also have to recognise, as was shown so clearly through the pandemic, that businesses that have international markets are more resilient to shocks, can take further, can take further advantage of the deals that we're putting in front of them. So the more we can get trade deals in front of small businesses, encouraging them to seek out new markets, the more we can safeguard them for a long-term future. Delighted to.
Talking about goods, but I want to hear him talk about services. We tend to see this purely in the prism of goods going backwards and forwards, but our great strength is services. Where are the services opportunities in this deal?
As ever, my colleague on the Business and Trade Select Committee has steered me back onto the right path. And of course, there is enormous value within the legal, financial sectors, the service economy, of which 80% of our economy is based in those areas. So we have to make sure that we're taking full advantage to get those businesses out and about, to look at where we can change international regulation and to see that there is more mutual cooperation. And of course, he's right and has been a strong advocate for those points over the last few months on the Select Committee.
Would you give way just once more?
I'd be delighted.
Very specific point. In terms of service exports, my honourable friend will know, as do many colleagues, certainly on this side of the House, that of course education is one of our major service exports. We have 5 universities operating in Malaysia. We have a number of schools operating around Southeast Asia, and all the other nations involved in the TPP. All of these will benefit from this particular agreement. And does he see that as perhaps other nations in ASEAN pick up the opportunity of TPP, there will also be further education opportunities there as well?
I believe education is always one of those jewels in our crown of export opportunities. And when you look at what is being created by UK schools in the Far East, along with universities who are now exploring those routes, you can see that there is an enormous amount of sort of ground to cover and opportunity, again, for those businesses to take advantage of it. We are, Mr Deputy Speaker, of course, looking to access a region that is worth about £12 trillion, well, closing on well over 50% of world trade. This vibrant economic region offers us not just the opportunity, but the ability to create new industries, to be at the forefront of advanced manufacturing, of pharmaceuticals, of genomics, of quantum, of photonics, whatever you really might think, we can take advantage of these deals. And of course, the removal of tariffs and technical barriers will only benefit those services, those businesses, and those advanced manufacturing areas that we're in.
On that point,
yeah, delighted to.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He's making a very powerful speech about the benefits of this accession agreement. And we've talked about goods, services, education, science, technology. This is all part of Britain's global soft power as well, that we will be able to export some of our technology, our education, our values, not least within food production, farming, and our values in terms of how we regard animal health and welfare. This is a major benefit of us joining this partnership to actually spread the good work that the UK does.
I'm delighted the honourable gentleman has made that point, and I thank him for all the work that he does on the EFRA committee, because he's absolutely right to raise the fact that we have such high standards that by joining organisations like this, we can not only serve as an example to others, but we can show how it is capable to create productive and profitable markets. On that point, yes, please.
I appreciate that he feels very strongly about this. Could he just clarify, though, for those people listening, the animal welfare standards that we abided by as part of the European Union are not the ones that we're going to see in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And indeed, we are letting those goods be imported tariff-free as part of deals like this, when we're about to put a whacking great tariff and consignment import and safety checks on food coming in from Europe. Does he recognise the difference there in the message we send about the value of animal welfare standards?
I do refer the honourable lady to my previous remarks about the TAC report on CPTPP. She has made a point about Australia, and I think it's fair to give an answer to that. But the point is that we are still safeguarding ourselves against hormone-injected beef and chlorinated chicken. Yes, there are variable standards around the world, and you have to recognise that not all trade deals are Christmas trees, as it were, to hang baubles on to say that you can do everything on. But you can lead by example, and just as our standards are the highest in the world, there's nothing to say that those aren't a key persuader to other countries to follow suit, to show how you can have successful markets on that front. Probably for the last time I'll give way.
But just following on from the point about beef and meat coming in from Australia, actually we've been importing it for years and years and years when we were part of the European Union. So this is not something which is brand new. This is something we've been doing for a long, long time.
Very true.
I think, again, this is exactly why you put things like the Trade and Agricultural Commission onto a statutory footing, so it can report on these trade agreements, and that their opinion is fully weighted with a government response that comes in with during the CRAG process and allows us in this House to consider. And if the honourable lady wants to come back and debate this in the general debate when we have it on CPTPP, I look forward to doing this all over again. But of course, that is the whole purpose of them, and it gives us the chance to take full consideration of the agricultural community's view. I've gone on far too long, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I do think it's absolutely... well, thank you very much. It's the first... I believe that's the first time anyone in this House has ever told me to carry on, but I'm very grateful for it nonetheless. We have huge advantages in the UK to strike new trade agreements to encourage a booming of our economy. It is striking that in the opening remarks that the Labour front bench do not recognise that since 2010 the UK's economy has outperformed Portugal, Italy, Spain, Germany and France, to name but a few. This trade agreement signs not just an intent to sign more trade deals in the future, but also signifies the approach that we can take if we work together with businesses, financial services, legal services and all industry across this country, and the value that it can bring both in London and across all regions of the United Kingdom. And I look forward to seeing its ratification, and I look forward to seeing this bill pass unamended.
In saying that you'd gone on for too long, you did manage to unite both sides, Mr. Mangnall, so congratulations. Richard Thomson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'll say at the top of my remarks that we in the SNP benches are also not looking to divide the House this evening on this. But I thought I might get the opportunity to preempt the jibe that comes, but the Honourable Member for Totnes got in there first about how my party is apparently against trade deal. I see the Labour benches were getting a side swipe with that rather nonsensical jibe as well. I freely admit we've yet to find one signed by this government that we're happy to support, but fundamentally, and I say it again, we're in favour of good trade deals and we're not in favour of poor trade deals. And I can't... the Honourable Member for Totnes is very, very excitable, and he's, for the purposes of Hansard, he's asking me to name one, and the sad fact is I can't name one that has been signed by this government. So there you go. And trying to help the Treasury bench understand the difference, and their backbenchers, it feels a little bit like Father Ted trying to explain to Father Dougal the difference between cows that are small and cows that are far away. Now, in common with the Labour front bench, we're not saying that there can't be some advantages which come out of the CPTPP deal. But what we couldn't be clearer about is that the trade deals signed to date, or even those that could have been signed if negotiations hadn't failed to get off the starting block, or even those that have hit the buffers in recent days, all of them, even taken in their totality and their potential totality, are a very, very poor substitute indeed for the trade deals that we've left behind. Because in the manner in which it chose to leave the European Union, UK not only created trade borders with 27 other countries, it also managed, unfathomably, to create one with itself when it created a trade border down the middle of the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But looking at the CPTPP, we have essentially swapped the 4 freedoms in Europe of goods, capital, services and people in a market of 500 million people with a GDP of over £15 trillion, which was right on our doorstep and which already took over 40% of our exports. And we're trading it here with a much lesser deal, with a combined economy of almost half the size on the opposite side of the world, which currently takes only 8% of our exports. And there's a great deal of growth would need to happen in that market, somewhat implausibly, I have to say, to even come close to matching what has been left behind. And here it's quite clear the economic benefits of joining the CPTPP are pretty small. And I know the government doesn't like these figures being repeated, which Mr Deputy Speaker seems as good a reason as any to go on and repeat them. But the UK government's own impact assessment indicated the long-run increase in GDP would be £2 billion, or 0.06% of GDP. The OBR even had it at 0.04% in the long run. Now, as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. But in a written answer to me dated the 11th of September last year, the then Minister of State at the Department for Business and Trade said that the impact assessment, where that £2 billion figure was coming from, had been independently scrutinised by the Regulatory Policy Committee. So I went and had a look at what the Regulatory Policy Committee had to say to get an extent of what this long run might actually be. And what it says in its document is that when compared to projected levels of GDP on trade in 2040, without the agreement, the FTA's main impacts based on central estimates and in 2021 prices are that UK domestic product is expected to increase by £2 billion. So what the Minister said in that reply will be correct, but just not quite for a further 16 years or so for it to come to pass. In the meantime, we have a very real and immediate drop of 4% in our GDP resulting from Brexit, leaving our economy permanently driving with the handbrake on. Now, in terms of the legislation that's before us, I understand that the Government on this occasion intends to adhere to the Sewell Convention and will be seeking the legislative consent of the devolved parliaments and assemblies for matters which overlap there. I would just say that that's something that the Government should be doing with every piece of legislation that comes through this place, and not just a matter of doing it performatively whenever it's confident of getting a positive response. But while the benefits of free trade are obvious, there's also an obvious benefit to having tariffs in place, because tariffs serve a purpose, and it's not just about protectionism, as some would have it. Now, we heard the Secretary of State say, and I was encouraged to hear her say that we would never compromise on animal welfare standards. But one sector where that's in very real danger of happening is in the egg production sector. Now, the Minister and I have had I can see him wrinkling his brow at this. We've had an exchange on this before. It's a sector that's worth over £1 billion to the UK economy. Now, tariffs exist currently to protect that industry from imports from jurisdictions, or mass-producing jurisdictions such as India and Mexico, where there are lower standards than we insist on for our own domestic producers and that our consumers rightly demand. Now, the Minister responded, again, not inaccurately, the UK doesn't import many eggs. Well, eggs are quite fragile. It's quite difficult to transport them, difficult enough sometimes to transport them from the shop back to your kitchen intact, let alone right round the world. But of course, the egg products that we're talking about here are liquefied egg products or even powdered egg products, which once you've put them into a shipping container can be transported around the world at very, very low cost comparatively. And it wouldn't require a huge amount of displacement in the market in order to get a foothold if those products were allowed in under the terms of the CPTPP. And let's be under no illusions about it. For all that it is a £1 billion domestic industry, once egg producers are gone, they're gone, and they're not coming back. So there is a very, very real risk of harm, and of whatever level we choose domestically to set our standards at, having those standards undermined anyway, because the purpose of the tariff that was there to maintain a block on imports which did not meet those standards will effectively have been taken away, of course.
I'm not sure that the member from Wyre Forest quite understands what's about to happen with the border target operating model, which fits alongside this legislation, where we will see a health check certificate required for eggs to be imported from Europe and egg products to be imported from Europe, and indeed a consignment charge, but no equivalent healthcare or standard being required in the same way for eggs that are imported from the CPTPP countries, thus creating an imbalance and making it more likely, because of the way in which eggs are produced in this country in collaboration with Europe, of the scenario he's talking about.
I think the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow makes an excellent point there. Of course, it is one of the ironies that in order to protect our biosphere, because we are no longer having our borders in effect protected by food import checks at Rotterdam, that there's basically been a free-for-all in terms of the standard of products that could come in. And while I welcome the fact that there will now be checks, it is very much at the cost of a financial cost that will be hitting consumers hard at a time when food inflation already remains high and we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And it's just one example where the red tape that we were told was going to be cut by Brexit hasn't been cut sideways, it's been cut lengthways to create far more of the stuff than there ever was there to begin with at the outset. Oh, with pleasure.
Very grateful. Just moving away from eggs, which I don't think are going to be the major export from Malaysia or other Far Eastern members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but looking at the opportunities for Scotland in terms of Scottish whisky sales, actually the last year or so have been bumper sales. Whisky sales in Singapore are up by some 90 million, Malaysia up to over 30 million, and the opportunities from being able to export tariff-free now to Malaysia are going to mean a substantial increase of what is our single most important food and beverage export. So does the Honourable Member agree with me that we shouldn't underestimate the opportunities for Scotland in all of this?
Yes. Well, when we were talking about eggs, and I will just stay on this for a little bit, the point I was making was about India and Mexico, which are very major producers. But of course, Scottish MPs are interested in good trade outcomes for Scotland, but there's more that we're looking to trade here than just... but nevertheless, I think one of the biggest impediments to any increase in the share of the international spirits market is very much to be welcomed. We would be doing ourselves much more good if we had a government in power with control over domestic duties, which had not just whacked an 11.1% increase in duty on that product last year. Because it's not just about the tariffs, I would say as gently as I can to the Honourable Member for Gloucester, that are significant here. Many other jurisdictions also take their cue in terms of the taxes they levy on that product from the levels of duty that are set in this country. And we set a very, very bad example, I would contend, and I would hope he might agree with me on this point. There's a very, very bad example set when whisky is taxed so disproportionately in comparison to other alcohol products within the domestic market of the UK. So, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. I'd invite him to intervene in me if he wishes to make a point.
Honourable Member, I was just trying to make the point that, of course, taxation raised here is spent on important issues in the United Kingdom, and that, of course, includes, under the Barnett formula, significant subsidies by the English of Scotland.
Well, what a load of absolute codswallop, Mr Deputy Speaker. Every part of the UK is currently in deficit. It may have escaped his notice. So I don't think there is a single part of the UK, perhaps not even London or the South East, that is not in receipt of greater public expenditure than is raised in taxation. So can he please park the patronising trope about England somehow subsidising everywhere else? Because Scotland creates one of the highest levels of GVA of any part of the UK outside the vortex that sucks every other aspect of capital and talent in, which is London and the South East. Yes, sorry with that.
Thank you very much indeed. And in the spirit of trying to bring this debate back onto the fantastic opportunities of Scotland, as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Brunei, I was delighted to go to Aberdeen and meet with a number of Scottish companies that are in the incredibly important industry of decommissioning and renewal of the oil and gas industry. Brunei has signed a deal, I think it's £350 million worth deal with a Scottish business. And that is something that is not subject to any sort of controversial issues. And can I just say, the contribution that the Honourable Member is making is actually incredibly useful to this place. And that, for me, is a very, very good signal why members of the SNP and Scottish members of Parliament are so valuable to the Union and to making contribution to debates such as this in the British Parliament. And long may you be welcome here in Britain.
Well, we seem to have been apparently pulled back to the top, and then I'm being tempted to go off down another particular rabbit hole. And while I thank him very much for his very generous comments, I know exactly what side my bread is buttered on when it comes to that. I've been a long-standing supporter of Scottish independence because I have a simple belief that the best people to run Scotland and make the decisions about Scotland are those who've chosen to make their lives there. And with all due respect to this place and its traditions, I think we could do a far better job were we to do that from the Parliament in Edinburgh. Now, I will, on anybody's terms, now get back to the purpose of the debate, as diverting as and entertaining as that no doubt was for all concerned. Now, on these benches, we retain concerns over the ability of through the CPTPP to apply investor-state dispute settlements. Now, while a deal for Canada has for now at least hit the buffers, it was concerning that nothing came out from the government about an indication of any side letters similar about investor-state dispute settlements, similar to those that have been applied in respect of the FTAs with Australia and New Zealand. Because that is a real area of concern about the that could go on to have an impact on standards and decisions that are taken here. Now, we firmly believe that trade deals done right can channel and create potential to support decent jobs and to raise standards not just domestically but also globally. So it's worrying in that regard that the ethos of the CPTPP means abandoning effectively the precautionary principle where the burden of proof is placed on the producer of a product to show that it's safe, and where that's replaced with the burden instead lying on the regulator to prove that something is a danger before action be taken. Something, again, Mr Deputy Speaker, which can only act as a downward pressure on standards. Now, the Committee on Regulatory Coherence will no doubt also become a focus for this, whether it comes down to things like antibiotics in agriculture, whether it comes to the impact of decisions on deforestation, or whether it relates to something as iconic as palm oil, where we've already agreed a 12% tariff on imports from Malaysia, irrespective as to the impacts that would have. Now, further, we also have concerns over the impact on workers' rights, the impact on domestic conditions potentially, the ability to be undermined by lower costs that come from having lower standards elsewhere, whether that's in terms of labour rights and obligations or broader regulatory standards. We have a concern over the impact this could go on to have on our public services, and also our ability to set domestic laws and regulations which don't come under which can come under challenge either from the economic forces that are unleashed or through the ISDS mechanism that I spoke of earlier. Now, all things considered, the Government has given a pretty blustery and boosterish contribution today. I'm very blasé and dismissive of the concerns that have been raised so far. As I said earlier, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will not seek to be dividing the House on this evening, but we certainly look forward to exploring some of these issues, in fact all of these issues, further when it comes to committee. Thank you.
Byrne. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I suppose I should start by declaring an interest. It was nearly 10 years ago that I wrote a book called Turning to Face the East, which was a kind of an encouragement for exactly this kind of initiative. So I am a supporter of CPTPP, and I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State, who is no longer in her place, for joining us at the Business and Trade Select Committee last week, along with others, to provide evidence on this treaty. And if my committee members are amenable, we will certainly hope to table a report on CPTPP over the next couple of weeks, certainly before the committee stage of this bill, in order to try and make sure that we have maximised opportunities for building a cross-party consensus on something that is very important to all of our futures. So I just want to say very briefly a word about size, a word about standards, and a word about settlement of investor disputes. But I think it does behove us all in this House to recognise the point that we are starting from, which is that trade and export growth is not where it needs to be, and it is not where we on all sides of the House would want it to be. We know that old joke that not all fairy tales start with once upon a time. Some of them do begin with when I am elected. When we look back at the Conservative manifesto at the last election, we could perhaps be tempted to label it a bit of a fairy story, because it did say very clearly that the goal was to set out free trade agreements covering about 80% of British trade. We are nowhere near that. We are, in fact, much closer to about 60%. Now, the Secretary of State put, I think, most of the onus on a change of administration in America. But the truth is that apart from the cut and paste rollover trade deals that we've had since we left the European Union, the truth is we have only signed 3 new free trade deals, and one of those that one of the new ones that would have been the 4th that we'd hoped to sign with Canada, I'm glad to hear is not dead, but it certainly appeared to have been running into trouble last week, and I'm sad, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the Secretary of State did not come to the House to make a statement about that news today. I think it would have been an appropriate thing for her to do, but I'm grateful that she has made some reassuring noises about it this afternoon. Now, on the back of us putting the point about the lack of FTAs to the Secretary of State last week, she made the point that she had pivoted away from FTAs. That isn't necessarily a good thing, because she did go on to say that she thought, like many economists, that FTAs do promote trade. But the bottom line is that our export targets our export performance are way off target. The government itself had set an export target of about £1 trillion by 2030. Interestingly, that hasn't been adjusted up for inflation, which arguably it should have been. But the Institute for Directors last year said that we need export growth of getting on for about 3.4%, I think. As the Shadow Minister, my honourable friend, said earlier, we're nowhere near achieving that performance. We are roughly at about 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% export growth forecast. Now, the Secretary of State very kindly agreed not to have a public argument with the OBR last week. I think we were all grateful for that, and did say that there were different models, not alternative facts, but alternative models in her department. And I've written to her today to ask for the publication of those models so that the Select Committee can scrutinise those ahead of the bill going into committee. Now, the reason that the question of scale is therefore important is because our trade performance is not on track. It's off track. And generally speaking, economies that trade more grow faster. And we want our economy to be growing faster because we all share an interest in the rising living standards of our constituents. And that is why this first point about the scale of CPTPP in the future is so important. Now, the Secretary of State has kind of stacked up a lot of her argument about how we need to go in the future to where the growth is. If we can't do trade deals with where the trade is today, like our partners in America, then let's go where the growth is tomorrow. That is a reasonable argument, and Asia-Pacific countries did account for over 70% of global GDP growth in the decade up to 2023. But China accounted for about a third of global GDP growth, and that is why I pushed the Secretary of State again today, as I did last week, to at least show us how we are going to get into a conversation about how we as a country in the future, if that moment comes, are going to make a rational decision with partners about whether we would agree to ratify China if China met the technical standards. We have similar questions to resolve on Taiwan, but we should be very clear that in his public pronouncements, President Xi has made very clear that he is ambitious for China to meet the technical standards. And so the question is, if China did meet the technical standards, would we stand in the way of ratification, or would other important geopolitical considerations inspire us to block it? And if the question is not merely about China, if the question is about the CPTPP's future in more general, given that we have set such store to this treaty, then what is our vision for its future? Where is the roadmap? We had a document that the Secretary of State's Department published a year or two ago about the strategic benefits, but the Secretary of State resiled from all of the numbers that were in that report last week. I personally don't think that is a good way to make public policy, but let me just put it like this. Our debate about trade policy and trade strategy would be much stronger ahead of the election if we had good figures about options and choices that our country confronts on the table. We will certainly do our bit to try and supply those figures from the Business and Trade Committee. It would be fantastic if the Secretary of State could commit to doing something similar. Now, the question that follows on from size for me is a question about standards. There were controversial topics that we took evidence on last week, and we will capture what we learned in the report that we publish. There were questions about environmental and climate impacts. There are general provisions about this in the treaty, but they're not enforceable, and there isn't much mention of net zero. And so again, if we think about this treaty as something that is kind of fairly marginal for trade today, it is about 0.09% of GDP uplift over 15 years, but is something that is geopolitically important, then we need to think about how it becomes a load-bearing structure for some of our more some more of our ambitions in the world, like the race to net zero. And so maybe when the Minister is winding up, he can say a little bit more about how we can freight this treaty more with some of our other national interests in the future. The point about food production standards has come up already. There are no changes to UK standards actually entailed in this treaty, but obviously there were concerns about SPS rules based on the precautionary principle. The evidence we heard said that they could be challenged. It's a legally murky area, and on balance it could be that the challenge seems unlikely to succeed. But nonetheless, this is something to explore in committee, and it could well be that the Bill Committee wants to ensure that there are just further safeguards written into the bill over the course of its passage. There are going to be an increase in imports of agri-food goods produced to lower standards than the UK's, and that is true when it comes to pesticides, GMOs, animal welfare, but not antimicrobials. So on pesticides, the TAC found some basis for weaker standards. On GMOs, the TAC found some basis for concerns. And on environmental laws and policies, palm oil imports are obviously controversial, particularly when it comes to deforestation in Malaysia. But the TAC found that the concerns were not non-present. There are concerns to be had. They found that the concerns were perhaps slightly overstated. The final point then is about investor dispute settlement. So again, this is the treaty does extend application of ISDS to Canada, to Japan, to Brunei, and one of the ways in which this has become such a big issue is that obviously organisations like the Canadian Teachers Pension Funds are some of the biggest investors in the world. They have very significant investments in the UK water industry. There have been, 1,300, 1,500 of these cases around the world. The evidence that we heard suggested that the UK was likely to be able to successfully defend these cases. I think one of the considerations that we could possibly hear a little bit more about is whether the presence of these clauses in the bill creates a chilling effect on the way that we want to regulate our markets here. So if we wanted to regulate the water industry differently in the future, actually would we not bring forward those regulations because of fear about what would happen and the way in which we would be challenged? So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the gains of this treaty as drafted are modest. They generally come from the fact that we do have a new FTA as part of this with Malaysia and Brunei. That is good for whisky, it is good for cars, and it is good for chocolate, like the chocolate made in Bourneville. Single set of rules of origin and single accumulation zone is a good thing. Access to some of the agri-food quotas, like Canadian dairy, obviously a good thing. Some of the progress that is made in the digital chapter, which the Secretary of State didn't talk much about, but that actually is potentially something that is quite useful and can be built on more generally. But I think that we would have to conclude that in terms of the trade benefits as of now, they are no substitute for really ironing out some of the difficulties that bedevil trade with the UK and our close neighbour in the EU. And we should all, I think, collectively across the House, make sure that we are doing what we can to advance the prospects of a UK-US trade deal. So, modest trade benefits, an important strategic geostrategic step forward. But the final point, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I wanted to make is to welcome this debate today. It is good to be able to have a second reading style debate on this. Like the Honourable Member for Totnes, I very much hope that the Government will make time for us to have a debate under the CRAG principles about whether the treaty as a whole goes forward. We would obviously welcome the fact, we would actually welcome the opportunity to have an amendable motion on that, as they have in the other place on the Rwanda bill more recently. There is an excellent report that has come forward from the Public Administration Select Committee today about the way that we look at treaties better. But in this new world, Parliament as a whole is going to have to get a lot better in studying these kind of trade agreements and making sure that they dovetail with other aspects of our economic and national security. So I look forward to the debate at bill stage, and I hope the committee will benefit from the report that we supply from our Select Committee.
Sarah Green.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to broadly welcome the UK's accession to the CPTPP. The Liberal Democrats support efforts that create opportunities for British firms around the world, not just in the here and now, but in years to come. But the reality is that the immediate benefits from CPTPP will be a drop in the ocean. Given the UK has, or is about to have, existing trade agreements with all but 2 countries that are currently part of the CPTPP, it is perhaps not surprising that the analysis suggests the immediate benefits will be limited, and the government's own projections show that the economic impact will be minimal. There are, Mr Deputy Speaker, 3 particular areas I'd like to raise. The first relates to the fears of our farming community, as has already been mentioned. The NFU are concerned about the lack of core standards for food imports. As colleagues in the other place have noted, when it comes to CPTPP, those concerns aren't so much about the protection of UK standards, but the standards in other countries which could undermine and undercut UK businesses through their imports. In particular, UK farmers producing eggs, pork and beef are potentially vulnerable to imports produced using practices currently banned in the UK. I can therefore understand the concern of the farming community, proud of the UK's high animal welfare standards in food production, worrying about being undercut by lower standard imports from elsewhere. I also understand why consumers will be worried about food produced under lower standards reaching their local supermarket. My Liberal Democrat colleagues and I are keen to avoid a race to the bottom and ensure our animal welfare standards are not diminished as part of any trade agreement. The second issue I'd like to raise relates to our creative industries, who are worried about proposed changes to copyright law. The UK has one of the best intellectual property regimes in the world. It is therefore understandable that businesses and creators who depend on strong IP rights and play a vital role in our economy want assurances from the government that the UK's accession to CPTPP will not have an adverse impact on them. I know the Alliance for Intellectual Property have raised a number of concerns. Like others, they have noted the lack of reciprocity in the bill in relation to copyright law, particularly as it relates to performers' rights. If I've understood correctly, the bill would extend payment rights or equitable remuneration to foreign artists who perform in the UK without ensuring reciprocal arrangements for UK artists who perform in these countries. This seems perverse, and it would be good to know what impact assessment, if any, has been made in this area, and any clarification the Minister can provide in his closing remarks would be welcome. The third area I wish to raise relates to the accession of other countries. The benefits from CPTPP may in fact come as other countries join with whom we don't currently enjoy trade agreements. It would, however, be remiss of me not to mention concerns, as previously mentioned, about the potential accession of China. My noble friend Lord Purvis outlined in the other place the reason why a debate about China is so important when he said, it is not just the scale of the UK's trade with China, but how resilient we are in relation to it. Mr Deputy Speaker, our trade in goods with China is currently at a £40 billion deficit. That's the largest deficit with a single country in our nation's history. Lord Purvis also pointed out that the shipping of goods from China, which we depend on for our consumers, comes through the very area where we have deployed military assets in recent weeks. It is in our geopolitical and strategic trading interests that Parliament devotes time to debating our relationship with China, and I hope that the government will make the most of the UK's place within CPTPP to protect the interests of our allies in the region and human rights from China's actions. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to finish by reiterating a plea I've made previously and mentioned already in today's debate by other honourable members, and that's the need for greater parliamentary scrutiny of all free trade agreements. We're debating this bill because primary legislation is required for the UK to be compliant with the CPTPP when it enters into force. In the past, the government has committed to giving Parliament greater scrutiny of free trade agreements and then reneged on it. For example, the government broke their commitment to give Parliament a vote on the Australia trade deal, which had terrible consequences for British farmers. That we are having this debate today is welcome, but I'd like to leave ministers with the message that it shouldn't be the exception to the rule. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to raise just three issues, really. One is the scrutiny process has been mentioned, and ISDS as well, and then some of my ongoing concerns about the impact. I'm a member of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. I'm the sole member here because the others are on a delegation to Berlin at the moment, and I'm sure they're working hard at this time of night and not having a dinner. As has been mentioned, the report is, we've published our report today, and I think it's a comprehensive and, of course, all-party agreed report as well. And we've been looking at the parliamentary scrutiny process overall for treaties and for free trade agreements as well. And to be frank, we've found unanimously that the process is unfit for purpose at the moment. I think Parliament at the moment, and I don't disparage the government for this, I think it's happened in the past consistently, Parliament is treated as an afterthought on trade policy. There's no meaningful mechanism that we've been able to find on how Parliament can influence the negotiating objectives at the beginning of the overall process, or oversee negotiations as they proceed. And we're never guaranteed a vote at the end on the final agreement. I think that's been made across the House on a number of occasions. And that contrasts with what's happening in other legislatures at the moment, particularly the US Congress, where legislators are incredibly proactive in the role that they play. And I don't think government should see the parliamentary process with regard to treaties in the future as an imposition on the government, but actually a method of improving the trade negotiations themselves by allowing members of Parliament to have an early voice and an ongoing voice in those discussions. And it's interesting that other members, the former DEFRA Secretary, made exactly this point when there was a debate, I remember, in this House on the Australia Free Trade Agreement way back in November 2022. And he set out then how during talks with Japan, the Japanese negotiators have used parliamentary motions that the government couldn't breach to protect their own country's interests. And so if people will see from the report what we've put forward, a fairly comprehensive process in which the House can, I think, efficiently and effectively engage itself in these negotiations with a sifting committee, a scrutiny committee, but always having the right to be able to have a vote on the House at the end of the day. But more importantly, I think, an influence at the beginning of the negotiations when the objectives are set overall. And that is part of the overall attempt to get greater transparency and indeed, I have to say as well, greater interest in the trade negotiations themselves with it. So I'm hoping that the government will take the Select Committee report away and come back with a positive response, because I think it is an element of very constructive recommendations that are there. If I can come on to the much discussed investor-state disputes procedures. In the debates in recent years across the House, members have expressed concern about the investor dispute mechanism, and I think it actually has, those concerns have moved into the mainstream, not just in this country, but also in other countries that are moving away from the system. We've already heard Australia and New Zealand have committed to the exclusion of the ISDS procedure in the future trade agreements, and they do so on the basis, as members of this House have expressed, they're not in the public interest in many instances. And I just quote the Energy Charter Treaty, and that's been the biggest vehicle for ISDS claims, and it's collapsing with France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain and others withdrawing. President Biden has actually now come out and criticised the ISDS procedures and basically he was excluded it from any US trade agreements and for the future. As the Minister knows, I've raised it in the House a number of times now, and on the, I'm perplexed sometimes. The government, we're told, is committed to the ISDS process, but on the other hand, it has acceded to both Australia and New Zealand not to exempt the ISD process with regard to the UK. And the last time I raised it, the Minister responded that exactly as well, the Chair of the Select Committee said, that the UK has never been successfully challenged on the ISDS. And that's true, but I have to say there's an element of hubris there in that particular position.
On that point,
certainly.
My right friend is making an excellent speech, and he is absolutely right to flag this. The UK government hasn't been successfully challenged on it hitherto, but involved in this treaty are, for the first time, countries with very, very significant foreign direct investment into the UK. Canada alone is $56 billion. When it came to Japan, obviously the other big investor, ISDS, was excluded from the UK-Japan bilateral investment treaty. So we do need an awful lot more reassurance from the government on this point, given the scale of investment from countries like Canada in our country and in general, but also in sectors like the water industry in particular.
I don't know how excellent my speech is. I'll just ramble on as usual, I think. But the argument that was put to me by the Minister seated today was that in Canada, if we can't trust Canada in these deals, who can we trust? But that's precisely the point, really, because in Canada, they'll have a parallel system. They'll be able to take legal action in their own country. And I have to say, I did, as a result of that statement by the Honourable Minister, I did go away and have a look at the figures with regard to Canadian firms under this process. And I have to say the Canadian firms they stand out as being particularly litigious. They've brought over 65 ISDS cases in recent years. And I therefore think there's this chilling effect, exactly as the Chair of the Select Committee said, and it can have implications for the UK's right to regulate at the end of the day if there's a number of cases waged against the UK, and that then undermines our ability then to act more freely when it comes to regulation of the sector, and also policy development, particularly when it comes to issues around water and public ownership in the future. And I raised this again with the Secretary of State previously. This is what I can't completely understand, is that whilst the government is defending the ISDS process with regard to the CPTPP, at the same time, in the negotiating process for the bilateral free trade agreement, the UK government set out a specific objective to exclude the provisions of the ISDS system. And again, I just find that a contradiction which I haven't had yet explained to me what the government's thinking are on this. The Minister will know as well, there is quite a remarkable broad range of concern about the ISDS. In October 23, a letter was submitted to the government and it was supported by 30 NGOs and trade unions, over 50 academics and legal professionals, and it was from both the UK and Canada, calling for the immediate negotiation of a side letter between the UK and Canada to disapply the ISDS provisions between the two countries. This is exactly what happened with regard to New Zealand, and for the life of me, I can't understand why the government hasn't gone down that path with regard to this particular negotiation. Can I also say that I want to I do want to express some of the concerns that have been raised with regard to environmental issues, but also labour standards as well. The CPTP includes a number of countries where abuses of labour rights are widespread. I'll just give a few examples. In Brunei and Vietnam, independent trade unions are banned, while in Malaysia, forced labour has been widely documented now in various ranges of research. And there are a number of CTPP member states which have not ratified some of the core International Labour Organization conventions. And the protections within the CTPP for labour rights are particularly weak. A member state can only challenge another over the failure to uphold labour rights, but only if it can be demonstrated that such a failure affected trade. And that's proved notoriously difficult to prove in cases like this. And so the ineffectual nature of this chapter is demonstrated by the fact that since the agreement's conclusion in 2018, no government has challenged another for abusing rights. The TUC has described the risk of CPTPP making it easier for unethical companies and investors to do business with countries where it's easier to exploit workers, and they consider that risk is significant. I don't think we've addressed that issue sufficiently. There are also concerns regarding standards in partner countries, and it's already been used as an example of pesticide standards could be undermined. 119 pesticides that are banned in the UK are allowed for use in one or more CPTPP members. And though accession to the CPTPP does not necessitate any lowering of UK standards in this regard, when the peers debated this issue, there were really practical questions around the sufficiency of the UK's border testing regime in keeping banned substances out. And again, it's an issue that needs further consideration in more detail as we go through the whole process itself. The issue has been raised, and I know the chair of the Select Committee said this may well have been exaggerated or overestimated in some of the debates, but the UK has acceded to Malaysia's demand to lower tariffs on palm oil to zero. I have to say the evidence that I've seen and the representations I've received from the trade justice movement and others is their view is this is highly likely to increase palm oil exports, and with it the risk of deforestation, and that will serve to undermine the indigenous and local community land rights and threaten natural habitats for species like orangutans. And we've seen the various range of research and evidence mounting on this particular issue. And again, it was debated in the Lords in the context of the potential protections afforded by the UK's forest risk commodities legislation under Section 137 of the Environmental Act. But it's actually unclear when these regulations will actually come into effect, and therefore the protections are not in place at this stage, many believe. I think there's also a view that there's an accession to this CPTPP will bring risks of the erosion of the preferences that are current, the preferential trade agreements that are now afforded to exporters in one country, bringing negative development impacts for others. And one of the examples that's been cited by the trade justice movement is the Byrne, the association representing banana exporters across Africa, and they've set out concerns regarding the potential impacts of tariff liberalisation in South and Central America for those they represent. And just finally, one of the reports that was sent to me was with regard to the health impact assessment. It was produced by Public Health Wales, and they identified a range of diverse potential impacts. It included the potential of worsening of global air pollution due to transport distances for goods, the potential loss of employment for some population groups, and of course the risk of ISDS cases being brought against regulations which seek to support public health outcomes. I think it's an important impact assessment that needs further scrutiny and examination, and it leaves me with the impression overall about the lack of impact assessments that there have been. So I look forward to the Select Committee report, which will go into further depths on this. And I just come to the conclusion, really, with all these risks involved, to what is you couldn't even describe it as a marginal economic gain over the length of time that it's going to be achieved, and which such doubts around it. I fear to tread on treaties and agreements of this sort. And I just think that, although there isn't going to be a vote tonight, I might be tempted at a later date to vote against. So I better let the Labour whips know that.
Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. CPTPP poses a serious public health risk, makes us complicit in untold environmental harm, and is another nail in the coffin for UK farmers, as one constituent put it to me last week. I'm deeply concerned about the livelihoods of farmers who will be exposed to increased competition from lower standard farm inputs, meaning many domestic farmers may struggle to compete. Yes, I'll give way.
Does the Honourable Lady, and further to the point that I made earlier, not recognise that the Trade and Agriculture Commission that was set up all those years ago because people were worried about what was going to be in the Australia Agreement, that is set up on a constitutional footing, that is a statutory footing, that is there to review all of our trade agreements, that includes people like Nick von Westenholz from the NFU, a number of other members from the agriculture community, that their report on CPTPP did not find that it was damaging to farmers across this country. And if that is to be believed, that report, would she not have done well to tell her constituent that this is not the case, rather than allowing that fear to run wild?
I thank you for those interesting points, but I'm concerned about the negative impact that this bill has on modern, innovative and sustainable agribusiness. I'm concerned about the worsening of the UK's environmental impact and fading net zero commitments that this government is shying away from. And I'm concerned about human rights implications that my constituents, as consumers, may be made to stomach. And I have many constituents working in the agri-food industry who feel they have been misled by this Tory administration. One farmer told me last week that this government says one thing with its many mouths and then does something completely different. Now, we ask our farmers to maintain high welfare and environmental standards, and rightly so, but some signatories, like Mexico, have almost none. Food security expert Professor Chris Elliott told me it's absolutely not a level playing field in any stretch of the imagination. Now, we Liberal Democrats agree with the NFU and the World Wildlife Fund that in demanding core production standards for agri-food imports, which would uphold the ban on hormone treatment for cattle and prevent the import of food containing any of the 119 pesticides banned in the UK, to name just 2 examples. Now, which surveys show that 84% of the country agrees with us? And I urge the government to adopt this. I will.
Sorry, just because I feel that this is a matter that should be hammered home, the opening summary of the Trade and Agriculture Commission report on CPTPP. Question 1. Does CPTPP require the UK to change its levels of statutory protection in relation to animal or plant or health, animal welfare and environmental protection? Answer from the Trade and Agriculture petition. No, CPTPP does not require the UK to change its levels of statutory protection in relation to animal or plant life or health, animal welfare or environmental protection. This is not going to damage them. She must go back to her constituents and reassure them, rather than allow this mistruth to run wild across the countryside.
Mr Deputy Speaker, he makes an interesting point. I think my view is on what the future brings. Now I've spoken in this place about the concerns I have regarding the mental health of farmers and farm workers. And the situation farmers face is stark. In 2021, over a third of farmers surveyed by the Royal Agricultural Benevolent Institute were probably or possibly depressed. Trade deals implemented since the Tory Brexit arrangement are causing significant financial stress and uncertainty to many agri-food businesses. Dairy, beef and poultry producers have approached me for help, fearing they may not be in business by the summer. One farmer in Castle Carey told me last week, we farmers are the ones who stump up the cost. Now, I'm proud to have some of the country's oldest cheddar producers in my constituency, like White Farms near Bruton, and many new artisan cheese producers, like Feltham's Farm in Horsington. But even award-winning cheeseries are not safe from the toxic tendrils of this deal. The effects will be felt by businesses in the supply chain as well, like Sycamore Process Engineering, a growing local business based in Spartford, where 57 local people work. If their customers go bust, so will they. Losing agri-food businesses would incomparably alter our rural way of life. The farmer in Castle Carey also spoke of the hidden cost of cheap food. One of those costs is welfare, both human and animal. Now, I echo the words of my noble friend Baroness Bakewell about the threats to Indigenous peoples in palm oil producing forests, as the Honourable Member has already mentioned as well. International Labour Organisation standards are not incumbent on signatories to this deal. We should have grave concerns about suspiciously underpriced food landing up in our market, where the average Vietnamese harvest worker gets £5.50 per hour, according to the Economic Research Institute. How can we know whether the people producing this food have been paid at all? The egg producers in Mexico, who will undercut my constituents by around a third, of subjecting their chickens to horrendous living conditions and are themselves at the mercy of powerful cartels. They live in slavery-like conditions, according to El Pay this month, where cartels have taken over all links of the supply chain, and violence and extortion add to the ravages of climate change. Is this the sort of modern trade we want to support? Mr. Deputy Speaker, I won't. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to end with a stark and urgent warning. Last month, the Food Standards Agency had to issue a health warning after a rise in salmonella cases from Polish eggs and poultry meat, 200 reported in 2023. That risk only grows when we open the floodgates to eggs and poultry produced to lower standards. Now, Professor Elliott warned me about antibiotics being deployed en masse without veterinary approval, without government control, and without knowledge of the antibiotics' provenance. This use and abuse of antibiotics is part of a frightening health picture. Professor Elliott cautioned most countries do not have the infrastructure, regulations, or oversight of drugs or pathogens. We could be opening up a Pandora's box. Batch testing imports just won't work. Antibiotic resistance will spread from plate to platelet, and we'd have a hard time swallowing this unpalatable morsel. Mr. Deputy Speaker, my constituents have a record low trust in the government. Removing water from an imprisoned chicken's egg, drugged up on antibiotics it didn't need, and shipping it 5,000 miles to put it into pancake mix and insipid sandwiches is what my constituents have come to expect from this Tory administration. Many of my constituents won't stomach toxic Tory trade deals. We must urgently renegotiate them, and we must have more mandatory parliamentary powers for future deals. We can't afford the health cost to our population, the carbon cost to the planet, and the financial cost to our farmers. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have the chance to be world leaders in modern, world-beating, innovative, sustainable agriculture, and to proudly keep our high standards and improve our food security. Let's not lose that opportunity.
Front bench. Dhesi. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is indeed an honour and a privilege to close today's enthralling debate on behalf of His Majesty's official opposition tonight as we consider the second reading of this important trade, comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Bill. It is essential to balance our support for this bill with a critical eye. Labour supports CPTPP accession, albeit with reservations. This government, Mr Deputy Speaker, is known to promise oven-ready deals which often break more ground in rhetoric than in reality. The Labour Party recognises the UK's untapped trade potential and is committed to harnessing it. However, we must acknowledge the government's overestimation of the CPTPP benefits. Initially, the government suggested a 0.08% GDP boost over 10 years. But recent forecasts have downgraded this to a mere 0.04% in the long run. To ensure that trade is a force for good, we must subject such deals to rigorous scrutiny and commit to progress on climate change, human rights and labour conditions globally. As right honourable members speaking before me have stated today, the devil is indeed in the detail. The failure to deliver on manifesto commitments, including agreements with India and the US, highlights the need for a realistic evaluation of the CPTPP's benefits. As illustrated by my honourable friend, the member for Totnes, there's no denying the importance of closer ties with Indo-Pacific allies, especially in these uncertain times. While the CPTPP offers trade advantages like rules of origin provisions and potential for improved terms, grand government claims of unparalleled opportunities and glittering post-Brexit prizes must be substantiated and grounded. It is my duty, Mr Deputy Speaker, to ensure that it is not just the skeleton of this deal that exceeds, but that British business thrives as a result. But my right honourable friend, the member for Harrow West, the Shadow Minister, in his excellent speech has already highlighted the concerns of our creative industries and concerns surrounding farming and China, as explained by my honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham, and the honourable member for Somerton and Frome. Considering we already have free trade agreements with 9 CPTPP members, the immediate benefits of formally joining the CPTPP might indeed seem limited. The government's projection of a mere 0.06% boost to the UK's GDP from the CPTPP calls for a measured evaluation of its actual economic impact. This deal puts at the heart of a dynamic group of economies, but it's crucial that we do not stop pushing for more ambitious growth. We do not have that privilege, Mr Deputy Speaker, after 14 long years of Conservative rule. Our stagnated economy needs a much-needed boost. Indeed, in the last 10 years, Britain has had the second worst export record in the G7. That is why change is necessary. Having spoken to British exporters in my Slough constituency and across our country, I know the challenges they face post-Brexit are substantial. The increased barriers and red tape, bureaucracy have been a significant hindrance. This bill must be part of a larger strategy to revitalise our global trade presence. Yet Labour sees untapped potential here. Take SMEs, for example, Mr Deputy Speaker. We recognise the immense contribution SMEs make to our economy with a £2.4 trillion contribution and employment for 16.7 million people. However, the current government's approach to supporting these enterprises in expanding their export potential lacks clear strategic direction and coherence. Labour's plan for small business aims to address these gaps, ensuring SMEs have the necessary support and framework to flourish in international markets. The CPTPP, Mr Deputy Speaker, symbolises international cooperation and unlocks untapped SME potential with around 375,000 UK SMEs not currently engaged in international trade, representing a £290 billion export opportunity. There is indeed untapped potential waiting to be harnessed. This bill also highlights the regulatory burdens faced by businesses, so we need to reduce the complex web of regulations. It further lowers tariffs to enhance market access and choice for businesses sourcing from CPTPP countries, potentially benefiting consumers. However, it is important to note that this may expose some UK businesses to increased competition from CPTPP exporters. But let us look more closely at the impact than the wording of this deal. As my right honourable friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington, eloquently explained, the inclusion of investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms in the CPTPP raises grave concerns about foreign investors' influence. We must scrutinise these provisions to protect our sovereignty and democratic principles. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our commitment to environmental stewardship is critical. The WWF has expressed concerns about the CPTPP's impact on deforestation, particularly palm oil, which could conflict with our Environmental Act commitments. We must ensure our trade policies align with robust environmental protection. It is essential that our trade deals do not undermine our efforts at combating the climate crisis. The government's optimistic portrayal of the CPTPP must be balanced against a history of over-promising and under-delivering in trade deals. The respected independent Office for Budget Responsibilities figures suggest that the CPTPP might only contribute a marginal 0.04% to our GDP. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government hails the CPTPP as a transformative deal, a potential panacea for our post-Brexit trade woes. But let's be clear, while the government paints a rosy picture of economic prosperity, the empirical evidence suggests otherwise, as excellently elaborated upon by my right honourable friend, the chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee. Remember, we were promised a sunlit uplands post-Brexit, yet here we are, squinting to see the benefits through a fog of uncertainty. It's crucial to acknowledge, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the broader context of the UK's export performance. I will give way to my honourable friend.
It is not empirical evidence. A forecast is not empirical fact. It is a forecast, the very nature of the fact that these are modelling exercises. And I do challenge him here. Either prove to me on any trade agreement where it has actually been what the value was at the beginning versus it was at the 5-year mark and the 10-year mark. Nearly every trade agreement, whether signed by the European Union or signed by the UK or signed by the Americans, has always been undervalued because the emphasis is on businesses and communities taking advantage of it.
I do thank my honourable friend, the member for Totnes, for that intervention. But just as the government's own figures for its aspirations, that it goes by those figures, but likewise we must respect the Office for Budget Responsibilities figures. That is a lot more rigorous in its exercise, and that's why I think we cannot discard those figures. Indeed, those are the figures that we need to dwell upon. Indeed, the wider British industry and the economy looks very closely at those figures. So I think those are the best potential figures that we have, rather than anything that the government or anybody else has put on the table. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's crucial to acknowledge the broader context of the UK's export performance. In recent years, we've seen a concerning decline in our export capabilities, raising questions about how effectively the CPTPP can reverse the trend. This bill must be part of a larger strategy to revitalise our global trade presence, not just as a standalone solution. This deal was negotiated, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by the party that has hiked trade barriers, crashed our economy, driven up food prices, engaged in damaging megaphone diplomacy, increased bureaucracy for our businesses trading internationally, and much worse besides. In contrast, Labour's objective is to increase trade and international cooperation, and we will be closely watching the execution of this deal. We know that the government has failed repeatedly, Mr Deputy Speaker, with their promises on the international stage. We support international trade and global cooperation, but it must translate into tangible benefits for British jobs, consumers, and our overall global economic prosperity. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, this trade cannot come at the cost of our moral and ethical commitment to, for example, human rights, labour rights, to food standards and the environment. Our approach to the CPTPP will be one of cautious optimism, balanced by a realistic assessment of its potential impact on our national interests. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we edge closer to a much-awaited election that will help to put the British public out of its misery, the Labour Party stands as the true party of business and trade, advocating for agreements that genuinely benefit the UK's economy. We support the CPTPP but remain vigilant, ensuring it aligns with our vision of a thriving, globally competitive Britain. We are committed, Mr Deputy Speaker, to a future where Great Britain not only engages with the world, but leads in a fair, equitable and profitable trade relationship with our partners around the world. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Well done, Sam.
Minister of State, Greg Hatt.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it is a pleasure to reply to what has been a wide-ranging and often well-informed debate. The passage of this bill will enable the UK to meet international obligations upon accession to the CPTPP, thereby unlocking the next chapter in this country's proud tradition of trading freely with the world. Acting as a gateway to growth, the agreement will place the UK at the centre of a vast free trade area currently comprising 11 sovereign countries. For UK consumers, reductions in tariffs could lead to cheaper imports, better choice and higher quality products, all whilst protections in critical areas are maintained. With over 99% of current goods exports to CPTPP parties eligible for zero tariffs, businesses in every corner of the UK stand to benefit. Before extolling, of course, sorry.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. I'm going to lightly sidestep the party political debate because he knows my interest in Mexico. I've chaired the all-party group for 5 years, and I'm proudly now the PM's trade envoy there. And Mexico is the world's 16th largest economy. It will be the 9th largest economy by the year 2020 and offers great opportunities, not least for the Northwest, my own region, which trades more than any other region with Mexico. Can I also point out that there are plenty of labour rights within the CPTPP, and the question is how they will be enforced going forwards. For instance, every signatory to the CPTPP every party to it holds obligations under ILO, and so it's about how we trade more, but also raise protections all around through the CPTPP.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I thought for a moment he was going to verge off into football, because I was going to congratulate him on his constituency team, Liverpool, beating Fulham last week, that's what I thought he was going to raise. But in any case, Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank him also. He's recently been appointed the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Mexico, which I think is a really important position. I think in general, Mexico is a great opportunity. The existing trade deal we have with Mexico, the rolled over deal, dates from a long time ago, from around about the year 2002-2003. So I think that is a great opportunity for Mexico. He will know that CPTPP includes a chapter on labour with binding provisions on fundamental labour rights, minimum wage, hours of work and health and safety. And all countries, CPTPP parties, are members of the ILO, and they're not allowed to derogate their domestic labour laws to give them an unfair trade advantage. That is how the labour chapter in CPTPP works, but I'm looking forward to discussing with him and doing everything we can to work together to boost trade with Mexico. So before extolling the benefits, Mr Deputy Speaker, of the agreement still further, it's a pleasure to look back, to be back myself at the Department for Trade, and to see the further progress being made tonight towards the UK being the 12th party to CPTPP. This is actually a tremendously exciting moment in both the UK and global trade policy, and something this department and I personally have been building towards for many years now. One of the earliest decisions, Mr Deputy Speaker, in this department back in about 2017, under the then Secretary of State, the member for North Somerset, was to explore accession to CPTPP, or TPP as it was then known. Now, this seemed a logical move. Of course, I'll give way.
Can I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for the work that he's done, both on this arrangement in general, but more specifically in Asia, in promoting our mutual trade and investment agreements with nations there. Does he agree that on the 67th year of Malaysian independence, this is the first trade and investment agreement we've ever had with this very, very encouraging Far Eastern nation with whom we can develop great and stronger relationships?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, he is quite right, and of course successive Secretaries of State have pursued this, including the current Secretary of State, who's personally obviously very committed into this as well. I can say in terms of Malaysia, I think I've made 2 visits in my time as Trade Minister to Malaysia, and we are really excited at having a better trade relationship with Malaysia. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, all this seemed a logical move to join CPTPP. It included many of our global free trading cohort, like Japan, like Australia, like New Zealand, but it didn't have the controversial aspects seen in free trade zones in Europe, like free movement, financial contributions, and dynamic alignment of the rules. And as the Secretary of State said, this agreement will grow. So joining CPTPP will be great news for UK goods and services exporters, and great news for the UK as an independent trading nation. This includes, for example, beverage producers in Scotland. I didn't hear anything from the SNP extolling this virtue, machinery manufacturers in Wales, as well as car manufacturers in Northern Ireland and the West Midlands. And according to 2022 data, the UK is the world's second largest services exporter, again a point raised by my honourable friends behind me. Joining CPTPP will help minimise unnecessary data flow barriers, empower the UK services exporters, and encourage inward financial investment, a point also raised by my honourable friend, the member for Rugby. Overall, Mr Deputy Speaker, will provide us with a new presence in the wider Indo-Pacific region, a region of paramount geopolitical and economic importance, and one which is expected to account for 54% of global economic growth by the year 2050. So I warmly welcome the constructive comments made and the support, Mr Deputy Speaker, from sectors across the country. In her opening speech, the Secretary of State quoted statements from the President of the National Farmers Union and the Institute of Export and International Trade Directors General, and I would like to add just one more, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that is from the Federation of Small Businesses. We had an intervention earlier about SMEs. The FSB said they're very pleased to see the UK officially join, and FSB research found that 45% of small exporters said that access to this market will be important for future growth. Mr Deputy Speaker, today we've heard a number of important points raised, and I'll try to answer as many of these as possible in the time available to me. I will remind the House of the specific purpose of the bill. It will enable the implementation of aspects of the CPTPP when the UK exceeds, specifically relating to chapters on intellectual property, government procurement and technical barriers to trade. Mr Deputy Speaker, we heard first of all from the member for Harrow West, who gave us his familiar explication of how we aren't doing enough trade deals, and then proceeds, Mr Deputy Speaker, to vote against every single one of those deals that we have done. He's seen his attitude to Canada, the faux outrage that there might be a weakening in the existing trade deal with Canada. We heard this from the member for Birmingham Hodge Hill and the member for Walthamstow. They also said the government is letting down people by not having an effective continuation of the Canada trade deal. OK, we can differ about that, but the difference in his case, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that he voted against the Canada trade deal in the first place. So he is now taking time to complaining about the weakening of an agreement that he never supported from the very off. On China, he's been reminded about the Auckland Principles, about future accessions to CPTPP. That all countries must accede to the high standards of the agreement, have a history of conforming with trade agreements, and also must command the consensus of the parties. On ISDS, also a point raised by the member for Hayes and Harlington, the Right Honourable member for Hayes and Harlington, it is in the agreement, but a reminder, Mr Deputy Speaker, the UK has never lost a case. The member for Hayes and Harlington called it hubristic. It is actually a fact, and it never prevents the right to regulate. On performers' rights, also raised by the member for Chesham and Amersham, CPTPP is an existing agreement, and there will have to be changes made. I'll give way.
It's the point I've made on previous occasions. I just want to understand the logic of the government's position of allowing it in this particular deal, but trying to avoid it within the free trade agreement.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, these are all matters for negotiation. And what happens in a negotiation will, of course, not be the same according to each negotiation. So it's impossible really to compare. What I can say is I think of 7 of the counterparts of the 11 CPTPs, we already have ISDS provisions. On performers' rights, I won't. I'm trying to respond to his earlier points. On performers' rights, also raised by the member for Chesham and Amersham. So we expect the practical impact here to be small. The IPO is carrying out a consultation on how it will be implemented. My honourable friend, the member for Totnes, Mr Deputy Speaker, made a characteristic, upbeat and excellent speech pointing out the £12 trillion GDP of the region and how the UK will be and is at the forefront of global trade and how the deal will make no alteration to our standards. Turning to the SNP front bench, Mr Deputy Speaker, and here a familiar tale of woe, failing to stick up for Scotland, failing to point out all of the benefits for trade for Scotland. He said that he's been against every single UK trade deal, and that, of course, is correct, Mr Deputy Speaker. But what he failed to mention, he's also been against every single EU trade deal that's ever been negotiated. And he wishes to rejoin the EU and be subject to those very trade deals that he spent years campaigning against. He was against the Canada deal, the South Africa deal, the Japan deal, the Singapore deal, the Korea deal as well. He failed to mention the particular benefits to Scotland. He was wrong when he said the increase of GDP is $2 billion overall. No, it is $2 billion per annum. And then he went down an extraordinary road of talking about eggs, Mr Deputy Speaker. Eggs, 90% of our egg consumption comes from domestic production. All eggs are subject to SPS checks, and EU ones will also be subject from Wednesday under the border target operating model. We haven't imported, Mr Deputy Speaker, no eggs at all from CPTPP countries since 2015. He mentioned, I think, eggs from Mexico. There's been not a single import of an egg from Mexico since 2005. I mean, this is most extraordinary scaremongering. And the TAC, the Trade and Agriculture Commission, said we found it was unlikely that eggs from CPTPP parties would be imported into the UK. So he is sacrificing the interests of selling Scotch whisky and other high-quality Scottish produce by starting scare stories about the importation of eggs which aren't coming to this country. He mentioned workers' rights. I've already said there's a comprehensive Labour chapter as well. The member for Birmingham, Hodge, who I thought made a constructive speech. He said the deal was good for farmers, good for whisky, had a good digital chapter. And he's right that we are doing more trade deals. I point out that we're currently going further with Switzerland, Turkey, South Korea, amongst others. He's right on the scale of CPTPP and growth. Pesticides, there is no change to our right to regulate and our import standards. We set the maximum limits on pesticides. There's no change to that. The member for Chesham and Amersham, she said we've already got deals with 9 of the 11. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, it depends what's in the deal. As I pointed out earlier, the intervention of the member for Liverpool, the existing deal with Mexico is a very old deal. It goes back more than 20 years. CPTPP is a very modern deal. So that means you can get a lot more done with a very modern deal than with a deal that is many decades old. She complained about the lack of parliamentary scrutiny. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, there have been 2 oral statements on this. 16 written ministerial statements. Ministers and officials have appeared before 5 select committees to give evidence on CPTPP. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a lot of parliamentary scrutiny over the years. On terms of palm oil, the TAC again said it's unlikely that CPTPP will lead to an increase in palm oil being grown on deforested land. And we've had impact assessments galore, but I'm happy to look at the member for Hayes and Harlington at his public health assessment. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, we heard a speech from the member for Somerton and Frome, which was alarmist in its impact on farmers. The NFU is supporting this agreement. She said the toxic tendrils of the deal, and even blamed, and I quote, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think I quote exactly, insipid sandwiches on this Tory government. Now, I'm not quite sure how many things you could blame on any government, but the quality of sandwiches, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think is going too far. And she started verging into what sounded a little bit like conspiracy theories. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill is the next step in the creation of the outward-looking and internationalist UK that we envisage for our country's future. Through the UK's accession to CPTPP, the government will place the UK at the centre of a modern, progressive and values-based partnership, one that spans the Americas and Asia, and which other economies are queuing up to join. It is the gateway to new business opportunities and greater consumer choice, benefits that will be felt in every corner of the UK. While the legislation may be narrow, it is crucial, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the UK's ability to accede to the CPTPP, and I therefore commend this bill to the House.
Question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary no. The ayes have it. Programme motion moved formally.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary no. The ayes have it.